Fun Ideas Productions presents the Fun Ideas Podcast.
We see the syphilitic shrinking obelisk, the white man's wilting dick. We see through dangling jowls of seedy game show trolls the smiling lie of the televised hive. The witches are watching with their thousand eyes. Witches are watching with their thousand eyes. We smell rotten teeth that speak beyond belief. A stick inside their skull would...
Hi, this is Mark Arnold, and welcome to Fun Ideas Podcast number 54. This episode is sponsored by the fine folks at Lee's Comics. Artist and previous podcast guest Scott Shaw has finished the cover artwork for Headquartered, the book on the monkey's solo career, and it should be out in February or March of 2020. I won't be making the trek to Beetlefest, unfortunately, but my co-author and also previous podcast guest, Michael A. Ventrella, will be attending and selling copies there. I've gotten the final art pieces and text from Victoria Biggers for the TTV scrapbook, so I'll be finalizing that book and turning it in soon. I still plan to work on some new Harvey comic stories with previous podcast guest Eric Schanauer. And I'm still waiting for the Warren Kremer book from my publisher, and I'm still working on my own Light Up Your Life travel agency, and of course the Mad book. Today's show is actually a two-parter. Author, writer, and publisher J. David Spurlock spoke with me for an extended time about the late, great Wally Wood, covering Wood's years at EC and at Mad. He knows virtually all things Wood. Here he is, the director of the Wallace Wood estate, J. David Spurlock. Okay, on the phone I have J. David Spurlock, and today we're going to talk about the great Wally Wood. But before that, David, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in comic books and publishing and other things.
I was inspired. I was a kid in the 60s. I was inspired by comics. I started out as a big Marvel fan primarily. There were a few things I was exposed to right about that time when I was first starting to read comics, like some of the Mad paperbacks. But I started out mainly in Marvel, and then I started getting hip to other stuff like the Warren magazines and some DC stuff. And then it took me a while to go backwards to EC, which became a huge influence. Mm-hmm. But so all of this inspired me. I was always drawn to the artists, the creators. Okay, mm-hmm. A lot of people, what they cared about were the characters, and I cared about characters, but I cared about the characters the most that happened to have a creator that really inspired me. Whether it's Fantastic Four by Kirby, or Thor by Kirby, or Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. by Steranko, or Thunder Agents or Daredevil by Wally Wood. I was always drawn to the creators, and so that inspired me to want to create comics, and I started drawing my little infantile comics as far back as I can remember. Mm-hmm. When I got out of school in the 70s, you still had to live within commuting distance in New York to work for the major comics publishers. This is not only pre-computer, but it's pre-faxes and pre-FedEx. Mm-hmm. So, you could live in Jersey or in Connecticut, but you had to be close enough you could drive in, talk to an editor, or to show samples, and I did. I was living in Dallas. So I studied commercial art and went into non-comics illustration and design. After some years, I became involved with and ultimately president of the Dallas Society of Illustrators. But this love of comics never went far away. The first thing I put out on my own, I did kind of almost like an underground thing around 1980, 81. But I didn't have any distribution contract. I just, blind faith, build it and they will come mentality. Print it and people will read it. But it was a little trickier than that. And so that was called Badge, named after the Cream song. And there are some copies. Some years later, when I got a distribution contract, we did that, kind of had a warehouse find of some of those, and we sent some of those out through Diamond eventually later in the 90s. So there are some copies of Badge out there that can be found, but they are very rare. And so that's the earliest thing I did, but it was like later, after I'd been doing illustration, graphic design, it started calling me back. I said, well, this time I don't want to lose money. I can't afford to lose money. I'm going to research the business. And I researched the business for about a year before I tried publishing again. This was about 92. I wrote to Jack Kirby, who I knew. Kirby and I became friends around 1977. And I wrote to him. I was in touch with John Carbonaro, who controlled the rights to Thunder Agents at the time. I was talking to him about doing a relaunch of Thunder Agents. And I was talking to different people about possibly working on that, including Kirby. Ditko was game. Dan Atkins I wrote to. He was game. But ultimately, my love of illustration, non-comics illustration, kind of avant-garde art, a lot of the illustrators I knew, like Baron Story and Marshall Arisman, their work was actually very avant-garde, and they were kind of bringing fine art influences into the illustration work. And they were becoming big inspirations to some early graphic novelists like George Pratt and Kent Williams and Bill Sienkiewicz and Dave McKean, people like that. So I kind of created, not only did I want to create my own comics, but I wanted to know personally and work with the talents who had inspired me to want to create comics. And that would be people like Kirby, Steranko, Wood, Frazetta, Williamson, etc. So I established Vanguard as my publishing entity in 1993, and I kind of created a hybrid of kind of an avant-garde art magazine and comics anthology, which was called Tales from the Edge. That started we launched Tales from the Edge in 93. And so it was a very interesting, eclectic crossing of comics talents and non-comics illustrators, but giving them a free forum in some ways similar to what Wood did with Wits End in the 60s. You know, giving the talent as much freedom as we possibly could to get as creative as they could. You know, instead of just saying, "Oh, here's a script, illustrate this." No, I'm like, okay, you've got total creative freedom. What can you do with it? And so I had Baron Story in all the first 10 issues, had a lot of Marshall Arisman covers, some Arisman on the inside. But gradually, most of those, and Diamond told me early on, anthologies don't sell. You know, we had some George Pratt. We had Dennis Calero's first published work was adaptation. He was a big Sting fan, and he got the rights to adapt a Sting song in the comics format. So it's very interesting material there, which in some ways, some people might compare to early Vertigo material. And actually, we launched at the same time Vertigo did. Yeah. Right around in 93.
Yeah.
The difference was Vertigo had Warner Brothers money behind them.
Right.
And I had like a credit card with a couple $1,000 limit. So started with Tales from the Edge, and then by the end of the 90s, I had moved to the New York area, and a couple of issues. Edge didn't sell well, didn't really make money. It was kind of almost an art for art's sake type publication. But we did a couple of special issues that were devoted to one creator. We did an all Pat Boyette issue. We did an all Marshall Arisman issue. We did an all Sienkiewicz issue, Bill Sienkiewicz, and we did an all Steranko issue. And the Steranko in particular did very well. And so I'm like, well, you know, my background, my graphic design and production background, I could easily, and my knowledge of the industry and the talents, you know, easily produce books on artists. That would be, you know, as interesting to me as even sitting drawing my own comics which in Tales from the Edge, I was doing a thing called the Space Cowboy as a character I created, and it ran originally in Tales from the Edge, and then there's some solo Space Cowboy issues as well. But once it was clear that the best-selling issues we had, the only ones that really made money were when we did an issue on one artist. By the time I moved, I was in New York in the late 90s. I expanded and we launched the first ever comic artist-related sketchbook line. Mm-hmm. There had been just a couple of sketchbooks prior, but there wasn't a line. It was just like a one-off thing. Tundra had done 2 sketchbooks. They did a George Pratt sketchbook, which is basically preliminaries and stuff for his World War I graphic novel he did for DC. There was a Kent Williams sketchbook. Both of those were Tundra, and those were pretty new at the time, like early 90s publications. Yeah. There had been, somebody had done a Kaluta sketchbook, and somebody had done a Sienkiewicz sketchbook. The Sienkiewicz, I may have been Fantagraphics. I can't remember who did the Kaluta. Sure, yeah. And so those were about the only ones. And now I'm talking about what I consider a real book. It's got an ISBN number. It's perfect bound. It's not a fanzine. It's not saddle stitched. It's sold through bookstores as well as comic shops.
Right.
It's a real book. There had been 2 Wallace Wood sketchbooks around 1980, but those were, saddle stitch, which is basically stapled, and those were only sold basically kind of like fanzines through comic shops and mail order. They didn't go into the major book trade. Whereas, when we launched the Vanguard line of sketchbooks in the 90s, we didn't have bookstore distribution and ISBN numbers and perfect binding and all that. We were doing full-blown books. And so we launched with Al Williamson sketchbook, then the Neil Adams sketchbook, Wallace Wood sketchbook, Jeffrey Jones, John Buscema, John Romita, etc. Mm-hmm. But with my background with the Society of Illustrators, and I was also teaching on the side as an adjunct art professor at various universities, when I moved up north, I started in Texas. I taught at the University of Texas. When I moved up north, I started at the Kubert School. I was teaching there, and I always like to credit Joe. He was like the first guy that gave me work when I first moved north. And then, but very soon after that, I met Joe Orlando, who was vice president at DC at the time and associate publisher of Mad Magazine. I was already starting to work on a Wood biography, which was ultimately titled Wally's World. Mm-hmm. And so I went to interview Joe, and up at his office, which overlooked the David Letterman show. I would look out his corner office window, and I'm looking down at the marquee for, the Ed Sullivan's Theater and the David Letterman show. That's high rent district, in Manhattan. But Joe and I hit it off immediately. We became instant, very close. Yeah. And Joe had a number of proteges through his years, and it's kind of like I became his last protege. And he was teaching at School of Visual Arts in Manhattan, and Wood had actually attended school there about 1947, 48, right after the war, about 48. And a lot of the top talents either went to school there over the decades or they taught there. Eisner taught there for many, many years. Kurtzman taught there. Orlando was teaching there. Orlando got Infantino to teach there, which after Infantino was no longer running DC, he continued to draw comics, but he didn't make any public appearances. And so once Orlando talked to Infantino into teaching at School of Visual Arts, that was the only place anyone could be in the master's presence, because he wasn't he wasn't doing any conventions or anything like that. So he introduced me to Infantino, and the three of us, I sometimes refer to us as the Three Musketeers, and we became very, very close very quickly. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up teaching at School of Visual Arts and eventually launched a couple of scholarship funds there, a Steranko-related scholarship fund and the Wally Wood scholarship fund. But all of that, my teaching, my involvement with Society of Illustrators, that all connects to my interest in creator rights.
Mm-hmm.
And so the relationships I was building with all these famous artists, many of which had inspired me when I was a kid reading comics in the 60s and early 70s, I started helping them on other things. And in the broadest sense, I really see Vanguard that way, is it's about promoting and helping the creators. And in the publishing part of it, that's just like one department in a way, whether I'm helping to book them into making appearances at comic conventions, or helping them look over contracts some other publisher has sent them, or anything like that. I've helped some of them get some settlements or compensation out of major publishers for work they did decades earlier. Where the reality is, for the largest part, the creators of comics are freelancers.
Right.
They don't get a pension. The companies, most of the time, no publisher's paying their unemployment tax on them. They're not set up to get any unemployment if they're out of work. They're not getting their health care covered by anyone they're working for. It's a tough life to work as a freelance creator, whether you're a writer or an artist. So it's some of these properties that are actually created by freelancers. That freelancers may get paid to draw a couple of issues of a comic, but while they drew and or wrote a couple issues, they introduced new characters that went on to make millions of dollars.
Right. Yeah.
And far too often, especially in the 60s and 70s and 80s, they get little, if any, compensation. As Steranko says, the only thing Marvel ever paid him for was to put either lines or words on paper.
Yeah.
Okay? He says, if you're working for General Motors and you come up with a concept for a new part that's going to make the car work better, or a new circuit or a new system that's going to make the car work better, or a new car design, you get paid for that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's all research and development, but the comics publishers aren't paying for research and development. If you basically, all these characters were created by people who their basic thought was, if somebody creates the Flash or the Green Lantern or whoever it is, Captain Midnight, and they say, I got an idea for a new character, the publisher says, I like that. That sounds good. The idea is, if you came up with the idea, that they're going to hire you to work on it.
Yeah.
And they might do that. Then usually they did. And they might, but you had no guarantee how long you would work on it.
Exactly.
And they basically take it away from you. Jack Kirby had all kinds of problems. He was very frustrated. He would create all these characters. Marvel would publish them. And then all of a sudden, one day, Stan would say, okay, I'm going to move you to another book. You created Silver Surfer, but I'm going to have John Buscema draw the Silver Surfer book. But, you work on something else.
Right.
And, that didn't endear either Stan or the company to the creators, things like that. It's like, I'm invested here. This is my creation. Well, yeah, but, you can't afford a lawyer, so we're just going to pay you page rates. And luckily, on a rare occasion, there's been a couple times I've been able to help someone get a little better compensation, for work significant creative work they did years later. So to me, that's very important. There's nothing in my, what can we do as an individual on art to make it a better place while we're here? That's a mission statement. And I like art. I like comics. If there's something I can do to help a creator, there's nothing more important to me. So that's a big part, and eventually, so my relationships would go into different directions like that. And over the years, I've worked with lots of people. Steranko for like 25 years, and Patino for about 20 up until he passed away. Frazetta, Neil Adams, Frank Werner, various people. And eventually, this came to the attention, and I had interactions with the Wood estate.
Oh, okay.
And eventually, the guy that was managing the Wood estate was Bill Pearson, who was a very close associate of Wood's. And the executor was another very close friend and associate of Wood's, which is a guy named Jack Robinson. Mm-hmm. And so I had, when we did the Wood sketchbook, I had worked with Bill Pearson, and that was a good success. And we went into second or third printing on that. So that was one of the better successes of things that were done in the many years that Bill managed the estate. And then we did some other projects, and at some point Bill says to me, every project that you work on does better than the ones I do without you. And I've been managing the estate for, I think it was around 30 years. It's from the time Wood died at the end of 81 to 2012. I think it was in 2011 we had this conversation. Oh. And he said, I've got some other things I'd like to focus on, my own books I want to write and stuff. Would you be interested in taking over as the primary management? And I'm like, yes. And so, but at the same time, and I mean, there was no artist, here's a guy who likes trying to get artists their due, whether it's just simple credit or some money they're due or whatever it is to, these guys, I know how hard they work because I'm an artist too. And that it's a tough life. It's not easy. It's not an easy life. Wood once said it was like sentencing yourself to solitary confinement, to a life sentence of solitary confinement. and that was one of the things with the Society of Illustrators. That now it's a little bit better now because we have social media and you can communicate so much easier now with your peers.
Right, yeah.
But a lot of the worst things that happen, I mean, some of the biggest stories in the history of comics that are still in the forefront are things about, Kirby and Ditko and people creating characters of Marvel in the 60s and the company benefiting so much more and them not really getting any ongoing royalties or anything like that out of it. And these things are still very much in the public eye. Yeah. And I find, say, creator rights issues like the return of original art or reprint money, things like that, are as important as anything in the history of the industry. And about the only thing that I could compare was, what happened in the 50s in McCarthy era politics, looked its ugly head over at the comics industry, and practically the whole industry became crippled by it with the Kefauver hearings and all that.
Right.
That's another story. But you can't, if you're serious a comics historian, if you're just a reader who really enjoys to read about the history and know about the creators and the history of the business, these are the real big stories, important stories that rise to the top time and time again.
Yeah, and they're at every publisher, because Harvey has stories like that about Richie Rich.
Yeah.
Archie does about creator rights. You can name any publisher, Gold Key, Dell, whatever.
Yeah.
So, why the particular interest in Wally Wood? I mean, I know Wally Wood's a great artist, but I mean, why did you have a personal interest in it?
Well, I discovered Wood in the 60s. At the time, he had been with EC, and EC, at a certain point, they stopped regular comics publishing. Mm-hmm. And then they just focused on Mad, which had been a comic book and then to keep away from being censored, they made it a full-size magazine. So he was with Mad and he had been with EC for like 15 years. So a very long run, very long, successful run with EC and Mad. And but once he left Mad, he quickly segued there right around 64, from 64 and 65, from Mad to Marvel, and then to Thunder Agents. And he did other work for time with Gold Key and Warren and some other people too. So it was right around that time, and so I was seeing him just right as he was on Daredevil and then launching Thunder Agents. He left Marvel. He actually created the Thunder Agents while he was doing most of his Marvel work. And there's a direct quote from Wood where he said he showed No Man to Stan, and Stan's response was, "That's a really good idea. I would take it if I could take credit for it." And then Stan just laughed, and then they didn't talk anymore about it. So, but he got this great offer from a paperback publisher, because comics were coming on strong in the 60s. There was a great resurgence after the whole industry practically died in the mid to late 50s. And so they were coming back strong in the 60s with a lot of help from the Batman TV show and a lot of creativity coming out of Marvel.
Yeah.
But really, the Batman TV show was probably the number one. But the other thing was we had Boomer generation, and they were the perfect age. You know, whether they were watching reruns of Universal monster films on late night TV, which created a great resurgence of that and led to the creation of Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine, or they were, starting to read comics. They were the right age group. It was a huge audience, and it was, and also there was just something and that's something that's kind of hard to explain to somebody that wasn't alive in the 60s. There was just a sense that anything was possible.
Yeah.
That you knew that there was trouble in the world. You knew there were concerns, but you didn't nobody had the feeling that everything was so ratcheted down that nothing could be done about it. There was an optimism that, if we work together, we can make things better. Whether it was artistically, in the music scene, in the art scene, in the comics, in the politics, there was this great explosion of culture in the 60s. And, it's not just in one area. Whether you're talking about it, 60s politics or 60s, the pop art movement or the music scene, but the comic scene is part of that. It's all the pop culture of that era. I wouldn't necessarily refer to the politics as being pop culture, but sometimes that would creep in there as well.
Yeah, of course.
But it was right in that time period. That's when I discovered Wood, and it was just Wood was. And I've heard a lot of other people speak to this too. A lot of people say, "Well, the first artist I ever came to recognize their styles on were Wood and Ditka."
Yeah.
And I think the fact that they had simple short names may have helped 8, 9, 10-year-old readers who might not, catch a longer name. But they also had very recognizable styles.
Yes.
And so that helps. So, and then I would say, you can add Kirby to that mix. So, and I see Kirby, Ditko, and Wood as a great triumvirate. And for a small golden window from 2/3 of the way through 64 toward the end of 65, for one year, Wood came to Marvel, and Stan knew that he was a superstar. Stan was thrilled to have Wood come to Marvel, and for the readers, Marvel readers at the time, Kirby was king for good reason. Kirby did the lion's share of the work, and he was creating the lion's share of the characters. And so people, that were young then, and still to this day, if you don't really study it, with a historian's point of view or fervor, and if it's just a nostalgic thing to you, I grew up reading Marvel Comics, Kirby's king, that's the end of the story, you don't realize that, Wood was the star. Kirby was the star on Fantastic Four and Thor and some Marvel Comics. Those books were selling about 300,000 copies per issue. Okay, it's between 250,000 copies per issue and 300,000 copies. In today's market, that would be a massive success.
Right.
Okay, but in those days, meanwhile, Wood was the star artist on Mad Magazine. For a decade. He was the only artist in every single issue the first decade of Mad.
Right.
And that was selling. The Mad was selling 3 to 5 times.
Yeah, it was in the millions by that point.
Yeah. Eventually, it got to 2 million. Their top issue was after Wood left. It was the adaptation of the Poseidon Adventure.
Right.
I think was probably around 1972 or something like that. That was top just a little bit over 2 million. But when Wood was there, let's say shortly before he went over to Marvel, say 63, 64, they were selling 1 million copies.
Right.
So that's 3 times the best-selling Marvel comic or the best-selling Jack Kirby comic. And he had won all kinds of awards. He was a member of the National Cartoonist Society. Nobody at Marvel was winning national awards, or it was rare. There was the Alley Awards they had started, named after Alley Oop, and that was kind of a fan award, and that happened through those would be noted in fanzines, including Alter Ego. Alter Ego they were kind of managing the Alley Awards. And so everyone would vote. They'd say, okay, here's our categories, here are the contenders, and everybody would vote for their favorite artist. Frequently, Infantino would win. We're talking early to mid-'60s. But Kirby and Fantastic Four would win, like, most popular book, frequently. But Infantino tended to sweep the best artist category. So Wood was superstar, and he had won he was winning a number of National Cartoonist Society awards, and that was a much bigger, much more respected institution than the Alley Awards, which was handled by a fanzine. So I got into Wood in that time period in the 60s, and he was just always, one of the top guys. The fact that I was primarily reading Marvel at the time and that he was only at Marvel for a short period didn't matter, because when he went to Tower, I was hip to it. I knew, me and my friends, we knew he was at Tower and he was doing Thunder Agents, and we were buying those books. The distribution they got wasn't as good as Marvel's, but we knew he was there, and we bought them for the Wood. It's like your favorite artist goes to a different book. Are you going to lose track of him, or are you going to follow him over to that book? When Kirby left Marvel and went over to DC, there's no telling how 100,000, surely 100,000 readers followed Kirby over to DC.
Oh yeah, it's like your favorite sports player or something, Yeah. They're MVPs. You got to watch them and follow their every move.
And so that same time, even though he had left Mad in '64, at '65 he's at Marvel. At the end of '65, he launches Thunder Agents at Tower, and then '66, '67, he's at Tower primarily. He was doing other work too, but that was his big thing, because he had kind of a lot of creative freedom there on Thunder Agents. He was kind of running the adventure books for Tower as kind of a freelance editor, creative director. But at that same time, Mad paperbacks were very popular.
Yep.
And frequently, not only would his work be, from earlier issues of Mad Magazine be included in the paperbacks, but frequently he would be the lead story because they knew how popular he was, and they were still proud that they had all this great wood material, and they were putting it in their paperbacks.
Right. We will be back after this message.
Hi, I'm George Takei. You know me as Helmsman Sulu on Star Trek. When I'm not busy going Warp Factor 8, I like to beam down to Lee's Comics in Mountain View and spend a lazy afternoon reading comics classics from Marvel to DC, from Dark Horse to Fantagraphics, and everything in between. So please, spend some time here at Lee's Comics and spend your hard-earned cash.
The Fun Ideas podcast is made possible by listeners like you and from Lee's Comics of California, selling you what your mother threw out since 1982, online at leescomics.com. And now back to the Fun Ideas podcast. So let's kind of take a look at Wood's life. Can you give us like a brief bio of Wood and how he grew up, what his influences were, and things like that?
Wood was a country kid from Minnesota. He loved comics, newspaper strips, comic books, pulps, movie serials, and he decided probably by the time he was 9 years old that he was determined to make a living as a comics artist. Mm-hmm. And he started working that direction, and then he ended up going into World War II. And then after World War II, he relocated to New York City, and he worked for Fox Comics, he worked for Avon Comics. Eventually, he grew to superstar status, working at EC. Mm-hmm. And really, the breakout year for him was 1952. Mm. If you look at his work, he was working at EC in 50 and 51, but you can see he's learning, he's getting better, but by 52, it's like, yeah, man, he's ruling. The guy is ruling. I mean, nobody could touch him.
I think that's the first year his style kind of was nailed down. That you could say this is Wood art.
Frequently, he could work in any genre. He could do superhero stuff, science fiction. He could do crime comics. He could do humor comics. He could do anything. Mm-hmm. He was working on titles like Weird Science, Shock Suspense Stories, Frontline Combat, Tales from the Crypt. But they had other artists that were like really, that some artists are more suited to one genre than another. Wood could work in any genre, but they had Jack Davis was great for horror, and he was great for humor. They had Graham Ingalls. Graham Ingalls was best for horror. So they had a bunch of guys that were really good for horror. So gradually Wood was doing less for the horror comics, and he was doing more for the shock suspense stories, and crime suspense stories were really revolutionary comics. They were social commentary.
Right.
And they handled very hard-hitting subjects like Ku Klux Klan and things like that. And even in EC's war comics, Two-Fisted Tales, Frontline Combat, those were not, all the other war comics were like gung-ho.
Yeah.
And that was the mentality back then. Basically, the media was like, if you're going to do war, it's sometimes it could get to the point that, you'd be rightfully referred to as pro-American propaganda, mm-hmm. or whatever they were pushing at the time, but it was all very gung-ho, rah-rah, go America, let's go kick ass mentality. And the EC comics were the first ones to deal with it on a more adult level that, hey, war is hell. Right. It's not just bang. There's a reason why there's a saying there. And that, we may have reason that we have to go to war, but, it's human beings. You may remember the Twilight Zone. where this guy's in World War II, and all of a sudden he wakes up one morning and he's the enemy.
Right. Yeah. I don't know
it's
that
like,
episode.
wait a minute, what's going on?
Yeah.
And all that is, that's a device. That's a literary device by Serling or whoever wrote that particular episode to give us that fresh perspective. Put us in the other guy's shoes. Let us see through his eyes, and so that for the benefit of humanity, so that we're more fully integrated human beings. And so this is, EC, and they were criticized for being gory, and they were gory, but they regularly ended with some poetic justice,
right.
Some O. Henry type twist ending, but the twist ending always had, whether you said it was a moral or not, there was a point, and the point, there was some sort of redemption. There was some sort of, no matter how gory, no matter how dark, how mean, how gritty that story was, the ultimate point was of value. It was something for you to take with you. It's literature, Are we selling this literature with word balloons in comic book style, and are most of our readers 10 to 12 years old? Maybe so. But, my father read comics in the 40s. Well, he grew out of them at a point, but he told me, he says, the last ones I ever read were the ECs after I was grown. He was working for a telephone company. He'd take his lunch, he'd go down to a little Greasy Spoon diner, and he'd pick up a EC.
Yeah.
It's like, and one reason was because they started adapting Bradbury. And Ray Bradbury, he's not just the greatest science fiction author of all time. He's one of the greatest authors of all time in any genre. His work is not limited to his genre. Likewise, the themes in EC stories were not limited to comic book stories for 10-year-old masses.
Yeah.
It went beyond there, and that's why it inspired such fandom, because people knew they were getting substance.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm laying my dime down. Yes, it was only a dime in those days.
Yeah.
I'm laying my dime down, but I'm not just getting 10, 20 minutes of entertainment that, like a cartoon with a punchline out of the newspaper. You're getting something much more significant here. The people who are writing and drawing these comics really care about the work they're doing. It's not just a way for them to make a buck. And that is what brings a loyal audience. That's what makes a connection. When you're like, I relate to who's writing these stories. They're touching me in some way. And so that's where you build your loyal audience. And so people, Wood, EC had the best stable of talent. Jack Davis, Wood, Graham Ingalls, Krigstein, Al Williamson. Frazetta did a little bit for him, usually in association with Williamson. Joe Orlando, just a fabulous Johnny Craig.
Yeah.
All those talents, whether you recognize the names or not, they're definitely worth researching, because they brought a level of intelligence to the work beyond what they were being paid for. And part of that was a camaraderie, and there was kind of like a friendly competition too. It's like, hey, and they all said anytime they would come in to deliver a job, they all wanted to see the latest thing that Wood turned in. It's like he was the gold standard.
Yeah.
And so I got in it. And as far as influences, the short list of Wood influences be Hal Foster, Alex Raymond, Milton Caniff, and Will Eisner. And most of your talent that came into the business in the 40s and early 50s, they would all say Foster, Raymond, and Caniff. Those are coming from newspaper strips. That was the grand triumvirate of adventure newspaper strip artists, not humorous cartoon strips. Foster started with Tarzan, then he creates Prince Valiant. Raymond's doing Flash Gordon, Jungle Jim, Secret Agent X9, and Milton Caniff's doing Terry and the Pirates, and later he did Steve Canyon. But Wood was also into Eisner. Eisner had Spirit, which was odd. It was distributed through the newspapers, but instead of running in a strip format, it was its own little booklet. It's kind of like a little comic book. It didn't have the glossy cover like a comic book, but it was something you could pull out from the paper. It's its own little standalone piece, insert within the paper. You could expand Wood's influences to Disney, Roy Crane, Walt Kelly, and others, but he actually cited his number one inspiration as Foster. But all those guys I named were all helped to inspire Wood, and he had a way of taking their influence and making it his own. And so he could tell. And there was a story I heard from one of the guys that worked with Wood, or a friend was visiting Wood, and he says, I really love wood trees. He's like, and Wood's like, what do you mean wood trees? He says, the way you draw trees, you draw the most fantastic trees. He says, those aren't wood trees. Those are Foster trees. Because he learned to draw trees from Hal Foster. And if you look at Prince Valiant, you'd be hard-pressed to come up with better trees. So it's like in Wood's head, he's still drawing Hal Foster trees.
Right. That's funny.
But he would take these different influences, some of the romance of Raymond, some of the polish of Raymond, but some of the organic qualities and compositional qualities of Foster. And then when it came to Caniff was a good storyteller. Caniff was, in some regards, a better storyteller than Foster and Raymond. They were all masters, but they all had, unique things. Caniff's art was simpler. He didn't put as much detail in it, and he did a lot of things in silhouette. That was a big influence on Toth and a lot of other artists. And also John Romita, who was the top Spider-Man artist after Steve Ditko, who helped to create Spider-Man. So Caniff was a huge influence too. But Wood had a way of blending these influences and it coming out uniquely Wood. I mean, you could still spot, this is a little toward the Foster, or this is a little bit to the Raymond, or he's using a lot of silhouettes here. This is a little to the Caniff, or here's an interesting camera angle. Maybe you got that from Eisner. But when it came, once he drew it, once he inked it, it became Wood, and it was very recognizable as Wood. The better educated people could pick out these little elements. It's like a recipe. We'll put the onions in, we'll put the Foster in, we'll put the cabbage in, we'll put the Raymond in, we'll put the celery in, we'll put the Caniff in. But after it all brews and stirs together, and you serve it up on the plate, it's Wally Wood.
Wow. And then he ended up working for Eisner, right, for a while?
Yeah. He started with Eisner as a minor assistant. When he first came to New York, he had all these drawings he had done. He was, through his whole life, all the way back through childhood. Here's a very interesting thing. There was a fire. The Wood estate had a fire at Pearson's place some years ago. And the vast majority of the original art that the Wood estate had, unfortunately, went up in the fire. And it is the evil gift that keeps on. Every now and then I'll call Bill and say, hey, whatever happened? The fire. Whatever happened to this? The fire. Whatever happened to that? What happened to that masterpiece? That that fabulous Cleopatra piece? The fire. It's not pleasant.
Yeah.
But one of the few things that survived the fire was there was one filing cabinet. When something gets hot, it swells up, and the metal in this filing cabinet kind of swelled, and it kind of helped to seal the filing cabinet so the flames couldn't get inside. The heat got to it. The cabinet was hot as hell, literally. But the flames couldn't actually get inside. So what was in there, a lot of it singed, the edges of the paper was singed. So if you ever see wood drawings with a burnt edge, that actually kind of authenticates them because that's some of the rare things that survived the fire, but they did get the edges singed. But most of what was in that one filing cabinet that survived was childhood drawings. And we have now scanned all those childhood drawings that the estate still had after the fire, and there's got to be a couple thousand of them.
Wow!
And through the entire timeline, from the earliest childhood drawings, he was creating his own strips and his own characters. Out of 2,000 childhood drawings, there's only like maybe 3 drawings that you can recognize as someone else's character. He wasn't drawing Batman. He wasn't drawing Superman. I found one drawing of the Shadow, which was a pulp character. I found one drawing of the Spider, which was another big pulp character. And there might be one more in there. It may be a radio character or a pulp character, but my point is that to him, it wasn't just about drawing. He was creating stories, and he was creating characters from day one. And that's one thing that we see in that. But when he came to New York, so he's showing this portfolio and his material varied quite a bit. There was horror material, there was like fantasy material, there may be like some, fairy tale type characters, there was humor material, shrunken heads, decapitated heads. There's some pretty wild stuff in his youth work, and expect to see a book collecting a lot of that within the next year or two.
Okay.
But he comes to New York. He starts going around to all these publishers, and this is about 48, right after he got out of the. He was a paratrooper in Japan, and so he comes to New York after he gets out of. And at that time, the paratroopers were part of the Army. It's the Army Air Corps. And then gradually things started shifting to Air Force. But he was in the Army Air Corps as a paratrooper. And so he comes to New York, and he goes around to all the publishers, and everybody's turning him down. And he's in one office, and he's got his wings on. If you were in the Army Air Corps, you got a medal. And people who got out of the war, they wanted people to know, I was in the service, I fought for our country, and it might stir some patriotism, and you might give a guy a chance.
Right.
Okay? So he's sitting in this lobby waiting to go in to see this editor to try to get some work. And he sees another guy there who's also got wings. And they strike up a conversation. The other guy turns out to be John Severin.
Oh, wow.
And so... which a fan of crack like yourself would be intimately familiar with Mr. Severin.
Yes. And DC.
Yeah. So they start talking, and so John says, "Well, let me look at your stuff." So he shows him his samples. And he says, "This is great." And Wood says, "Yeah, but I haven't got any work. I can't afford to live in New York without any work." He says, "This is the last place." He says, "I've seen every other publisher in town. Everybody's turned me down. And if this guy doesn't hire me, I'm going to have to go back to Minnesota. I won't have any choice." And Severin's like, "This stuff is too good. You cannot go back to Minnesota. You will make it. You just got to find somebody. Somebody's got to be the first person to give you some work." So Wood was called in to see the editor first. And when he came out, John said, "How did it go?" He says, "He turned me down too."
Wow. So
John then says, "Look, I'm sharing a studio with a couple of other guys." Well, it turns out it was Harvey Kurtzman and Will Elder.
Yeah.
Okay? He says, "Come over and visit the studio. If, we may not have anything you can help us on, but it's just good to know people, to network." And so he did, and he went over there, and that's when he first met Harvey Kurtzman and Will Elder. And so they all liked the work, but at the same time they said, "Well, we kind of see why you hadn't been offered jobs, but yes, there is a unique quality here, and you you need to get work because it's obvious there's a lot of talent there, and you could go into all kinds of directions. At some point, Harvey said, Bern Hogarth, who took over the Tarzan newspaper strip from Hal Foster, Hogarth started up a school. And you can, as a veteran, you can go there and the government will pay your tuition. He says, do you think I really need to go back to school? He says, actually, you don't need to go to that school to learn to do artwork. You already know the art. But it's a great place to network, and all the teachers are pros, including Eisner himself. Mm-hmm. And you might end up getting a job assisting one of them. So, did I say Eisner? I meant Hogarth, including Hogarth, and Hogarth himself. At that time, Eisner wasn't teaching it at the school. Mm-hmm. Hogarth was. And so he went and he enrolled. It was called the School for Cartoonists and Illustrators at the time. Right. And some years later, they changed the name to School of Visual Arts. Mm-hmm. I ended up teaching there. Like I said, when I moved up north, I taught at the Kubert School, and then I went over to the School of Visual Arts. But so he's going there for a little while, and he did end up. It kind of segued into him assisting Eisner and assisting George Wonder, who had replaced Kniff on Terry and the Pirates. So when he started with Eisner, it was about probably late 48, maybe early 49. But he quickly moved on. He was doing what normal assistants would do, which was sharpen pencils, empty waste paper baskets. After the regular artist would draw and then it would be inked, then they needed someone to erase the leftover pencils. So only the inked art would be left on the board to be shot. And then gradually you work your way up to helping to draw backgrounds and maybe do a little inking or maybe do a little lettering. So that's basically what he was doing when he first started with Eisner in late 48 or early 49. Mm-hmm. But then he quickly moved on and was pretty quickly he started getting work, doing his own work. And he started a studio with a couple of guys that he met at school, and one of those was Harry Harrison. Okay. And Harry Harrison's great claim to fame is some years later, he became quite a famous science fiction author. He and Wood bonded over their mutual love of science fiction. But Harrison wrote the story, which was originally called Make Room, Make Room, which was adapted into the film Soylent Green. Right. That was a hugely successful science fiction film. That was one of the most successful science fiction films, around the time of, say, the first Planet of the Apes. Before, if you're going to talk about very big science fiction films predating Star Wars, you're basically looking at Soylent Green, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and Planet of the Apes. Yeah. So he was Wood's original partner coming out of school, and they opened a studio and they were getting work together. But after Wood became the big success at EC by 1952, he was the undisputed greatest science fiction comics creator in America. And at that time, the Spirit had been running for many years by that point, and Eisner had started to do some other type of work. He wasn't working full-time on Spirit. He had a number of assistants. He started getting some contracts out of the government to do educational comics for the GIs. Right. And at that time, he was focusing more on that, and he would supervise, and he'd do a little work on the Spirit strip, and he had Jules Pfeiffer, who became this fabulously brilliant, writer, screenplay writer, and cartoonist. Years later, he was working as an assistant to Eisner at the time. So Eisner called Wood when Wood, his old assistant, is now the superstar, and told him the Spirit was in trouble. And as a last-ditch effort to try to save the Spirit, he wanted Wood to come in and to take over the Spirit, the art, that Pfeiffer would write it, but inspired by Wood's success with science fiction, he wanted to take the Spirit into outer space. And Pfeiffer was not a science fiction fan like Wood and Harry Harrison was, and he'd lean more toward what the Spirit had been doing before, which is kind of noiristic detective work.
Right.
And so Pfeiffer was not gung-ho about it, but, Eisner said, this is what we're going to do with or without you. Pfeiffer said, okay. And he wrote the story and Wood illustrated it, and Eisner supervised it and edited it. Well, it was fabulous work, and it's legendary at this point. And for that combination of talents, Eisner, Wood, and Pfeiffer working together, it's kind of mind-blowing that the three of those guys did work together.
Yeah.
and at the time, it may look a little dated now, now in the new century, but there's a great quote from Eisner that he said decades after that work was done. He says it's unbelievable how modern Wood's work looked in 1952.
Yeah.
And that, you look at that hardware and his machinery. He was very famous for his rocket ships and his machinery. There's a great scene where the Spirit is looking out the porthole of the rocket and his reflection is there. When you're by a window, a lot of times you'll see yourself reflected. But to try to draw that is very difficult. To try to draw that limited to comic book art in India ink is even more difficult. And or the moonscapes that Wood did were just fantastic. They were practically photographic. So it was amazing stuff, and it's stood the test of time surprisingly well. And decades later, Eisner wrote a little thing about it where he really complimented Wood about how modern it looked for decades afterwards. Now, it is now very retro to us here in the 21st century.
Right.
Anytime I cite the 21st century, I'm tempted to end it with Buck. Like I'm talking to Buck Rogers.
Right.
Journey to the 21st century. Here in the 21st century, Buck, we do it this way. So they weren't able to. Unfortunately, they weren't able to save the Spirit, but it made a real gem, right there at the end of the run that has, been a gem that's still appreciated to this day for comics enthusiasts.
Right. And at that point, I guess he was. This is Wood. Was really heavily involved with EC, so he didn't have time much after Spirit ended, right, to do anything else, or did he take on any other projects?
Actually, that's a subject that I have never seen anyone other than myself discuss.
Huh.
And that is a very important thing. If you get into detail about that little stint on the Outer Space Spirit, is that there was a fantastic launch by Wood, all puns intended, and but after a few weeks, a few episodes, there was a little bit of it that wasn't Wood, that he was getting some assistance, and he was getting assistance from Eisner's regular assistants, and the reason is because the fact of the matter is that Wood had more than anyone's full-time employment. It wasn't that he was on salary. That's not what I'm insinuating. I'm saying that he was already committed to EC.
Yeah.
He would be doing a story for every issue of Frontline Combat.
Right.
A story for every issue of Two-Fisted Tales. A story for every issue of Shock Suspense Stories. A story for every issue of Crime Suspense Stories. A story for every issue of Weird Science Fantasy. And frequently 2 stories for Weird Science.
Yeah.
Every issue.
Right.
That is enough work to keep three guys busy.
Yeah.
Now,
and then Mad was at it.
What do you do? I think this may have been just predating Mad, right before the launch
right.
of Mad. What do you do when you have a Now, you have to realize something. That whole generation, the ultimate success story was not drawing comic books. Even if they preferred the comic book format, the great successes, the people who got the respect and the people who made the real money were the newspaper strip artists. Mm-hmm. Those guys were famous. They were celebrated. Articles would run in newspapers about what this newspaper cartoonist was up to. They didn't run articles in newspapers about what comic book artists were into. Mm. It was basically, if you couldn't get work with a newspaper strip, where do you go? Well, you can work for those cheap little smutty comic books. That's right. That's downscale. That was considered the bottom of the barrel for the entertainment industry. But the newspaper strips were considered like practically Hollywood.
Right.
And so that was the goal. So here we have Wood is now the superstar in comic books, particularly in the science fiction genre. He is swamped with work, and the phone rings. And it is his idol and mentor, one of his biggest inspirations, saying, "Would you please do me a favor and help save my strip?" The strip that inspired Wood. And there is actually, I said how he created his own stuff, and you rarely saw him drawing someone else's character. There are a couple of childhood drawings where you can see he was directly learning from Eisner, where he basically redrew an Eisner scene. Okay, so this is one of his biggest influences, an idol to him, saying, "I need your help. Mm-hmm. Please help me. The strip's going downhill. I think you might be able to resuscitate it." Mm-hmm. So, despite he ignored the fact that he needed sleep, he ignored the fact that he was a normal human being who needed sleep and water and food, and didn't have any time. Pushed away time for sleep and food and things like going to the bathroom. I've got the spirit to draw, and it's not just a comic book, it's distributed nationwide through the newspapers. It was like a dream come true. He just didn't have the time to do it, but he didn't want to let his idol down.
Right.
So he accepted the gig, but he still had his obligations to EC, which was his primary living. That was the lion's share of his living. Mm-hmm. So yes, after a few weeks of working his ass off, turning out top quality work on the Eisner strip, there was he was short. Suddenly, his body demanded he sleep after a couple of weeks, and things like that. And so there were a couple episodes where Eisner had to put a couple of his assistants in there to help finish it up, and you can see a little change in the style of the art there. But that's exactly why that happened, was because Wood came to Eisner's aid at Eisner's request, despite the fact that he was already swamped with work. Mm-hmm. But that's why that happened.
Got it. Okay. And then, moving on, so, he continued with EC to the end of the run, and of course, long story about, how EC folded with the Comics Code, and then Mad took over. You told me before we ever spoke right now, that Wood basically helped save Mad. So how and why?
This is another story that... once the info gets out there, and this story hasn't been well disseminated. Mm-hmm. I put it into the biography that I wrote with my co-author Steve Starger of Wally's World. We covered it in there, and I have said it. There are a number of Facebook groups, Wood groups, including the Wallace Wood Estate page, that I help to manage and I contribute to significantly, and I brought it up, and there's an EC group. But I was quite surprised recently when Roger Hill has this EC Fanatic fanzine he publishes, gorgeous, one of the greatest fanzines ever published.
Right.
And he comes up with great information, and there was an EC associate, Sid Check, who worked in the Wood studio circa 1950, and Roger Hill, who publishes his EC Fanatic publication, he's done the greatest research on Sid Check that anyone has ever done. And he should be applauded for that. And Sid Check was a close associate of Wood, and Sid Check may have been the first guy in the business to try to imitate Wood. And so the style that most people know as Sid Check style is, some people will mistake it as Wood. Sometimes they won't know if it's not signed or they don't see the signature. They'll think, oh, well, obviously Wood had a hand here. Well, he may have. And when they were working together in Wood Studio, they would, help each other out. For his job, Wood came in, and he'd have Check help him or whatever. Or Check may have an assignment, he may ask Wood to help. And so Wood, Orlando's style, he picked up a lot from Wood too. They were all working there together. After a little while, Harry Harrison moved on, but Orlando and Sid Check and Roy Krinkle worked there with them for a while, mostly on backgrounds in the original Wood studio. But once he got full-time with EC, they shut down the larger Wood studio because he's mostly working on his own now for the Easton. But as far as the saving of Mad, so what happened was the founding editor on Mad was Harvey Kurtzman. And Kurtzman deserves all the credit he gets in regards to Mad. Kurtzman is seen as one of the true geniuses to come out of the comic book field. And his greatest success was Mad. Now he was looking to... Kurtzman was editing the EC military books, Two-Fisted Tales and Frontline Combat. But he needed to make more money. Now, Kurtzman had a style of artwork that was very much kind of like an animation style. It was much more spontaneous, very much it was all about gesture. It was all about the movement. It's all about the body language and the movement, the way you can use the movement of a figure to forward the story, to tell the story. That's what Kurtzman was about. And he was about other things too, but when it came to his own art, that's what really was his art was about. But a lot of comics readers didn't really respond to his style of finished art because it was, in some ways, it was very loose. It had a very loose and spontaneous look. And a lot of animators or humorous cartoonists could recognize this is brilliant work. And the people that he worked with, like Wood and Will Elder and Severin, they knew Kurtzman was brilliant. And the publisher of Mad, Bill Gaines, he knew Kurtzman was brilliant. But Kurtzman was like, he didn't do a lot of his own artwork. He did a lot of the covers. He would take more time on the covers for the war comics at EC, Frontline Combat, Two-Fisted Tales. And he did beautiful color separations. Everyone always thinks that Marie Severin did all the coloring at EC. No, she was the primary colorist. But some of the artists cared so much about the art they'd colored themselves. Wood colored a lot of his covers. He wouldn't necessarily color his interiors because he didn't have time. He was too much in demand to do the penciling and inking. But he would take the time to color his covers. Likewise, you had a couple of guys that were editors there who were also artists. You've got Johnny Craig, and you've got Al Feldstein, and you've got Harvey Kurtzman. All three of those guys were artists, writers, and editors.
Yes.
So they would frequently color their own covers when they would illustrate a cover. And I've seen a couple that Graham Ingalls, a.k.a. Ghastly, specialized in horror work. He would color some of his covers too to get just the perfect shade of putrid green zombie.
Right.
flesh tones. Anyway, so Kurtzman was saying to Gaines he needed to make more money, and Gaines is like, well, you'd have to take on another book, but we don't need any more war books. And so Gaines and the other editor there, and I think he was in the room while this discussion was going on, Al Feldstein, they all knew that Kurtzman had this great flair for humor.
Right.
And so the idea of doing a humor book came up, and they batted around a couple ideas for titles, and it ended up being Mad. So there is no Mad without Harvey, because he created it. Right. But Harvey knew who there at EC could do humor work. Right. He knew, and at the time, Will Elder was not considered a major artist. Right. He usually worked. Occasionally, you would see a story he would do on his own, but frequently he would collaborate with either Severin or Kurtzman on something. Right. Yeah. And so he had not really come into the spotlight on his own. But once they got Mad, Harvey knew that Will Elder was a very funny guy. Yeah. And he was a real cut up. He was a clown. And so Harvey knew that, and they would sit around joking around, together, and they worked in the studio together for years. And so Harvey gave Will lots of work, and so Will really started to shine in Mad like he had never shown before. That he really came into his own on Mad. And then Jack Davis, even though Jack Davis was he could do westerns, he could do anything. He could do horror, he could do science fiction. There was always a little cartoony feel to his work. Right. And so and Harvey was very familiar with Davis, so he knew he wanted Davis on it. So it was a very, it was Harvey's top first pick guys. It was Davis, Wood, Severin, and Elder. That was it. Yep. That's the whole kit and caboodle. And in the beginning, Kurtzman was writing practically every story. After a while, right about the time Mad hit, is when all this political McCarthyism, right-wing craziness went on in the 50s, where people are telling everyone to spy on their neighbors. Report them to the officials if you see anything suspicious. There's a communist around every corner, right. And you need to report. You need to call the authorities and report your neighbors if you see anything suspicious. I mean, this was nasty business that was going on in the 50s. And meanwhile, you start to get a couple of senators like McCarthy and Kefauver, who had their own political careers that they were trying to bolster. And so they wanted power. Everyone I talked to, I wasn't around at the time, but the people I know that were, including Joe Orlando and Carmine Infantino, they all said that Kefauver was hoping to get the vice presidential seat with Adlai Stevenson. When he ran for president in the 50s. Right. And so he needed to get his name in front of the public. So the best way, they had all these hearings on un-American activities going on, and so there was no better way for a senator to get known outside of their state. And you have to remember again, you got radio, TV was new. That's the new thing in 1953. It had been radio before that. There's no internet. And now you got TV, and they're airing these congressional hearings, as we should probably expect to see again soon. I understand PBS will be airing some congressional hearings coming up very shortly. And I'll be tuned into those because it is very important national significance, and that the citizenry knows what's going on and what's at stake. So So Estes Kefauver, he was looking to get his name known. So he was like, okay, what can I look into that may be, harmful to America, that I can put a spotlight on, that will, in the meantime, put my name in front of the public on a national level, not just for my state that I'm supposed to represent. And so he got a hold of this book, Seduction of the Innocent, which was blaming all of America's woes, which in those days they were referring to as juvenile delinquency.
Right.
And there's some films that I always break up when you see the films, like, well, how do you recognize a juvenile delinquent? Well, they tend to wear dungarees.
Yes.
They roll, they don't have the money to pay a tailor, or their mothers are so poor at being mothers that they can't hem up their dungarees, so they just roll the legs up, and they wear T-shirts. Who would wear T-shirt? Have the audacity to wear T-shirt in public? An undershirt, and they wear T-shirts, and they roll up their cigarettes in the sleeve of their T-shirts, and they chew gum, and they put grease in their hair, and that's to keep the lice out, because with these, you never know where these people are hanging out. They may need some grease in their hair to keep the lice out.
Right.
So these were the juvenile delinquencies. We thought that after World War II that everything was going to be peace and wonderful and new houses and everything, and to a large extent it was. But then all of a sudden you had rebels without a cause, and they were fighting something. They didn't even know what they were fighting, but they knew they didn't fit into this clean-cut, flat-top, Letterman sweatered life that was being fed to them on a spoon. So anyway, this Kefauver started this, congressional hearings into juvenile delinquency, and they start bringing up comic books, and it caused a big ruckus, and it really damaged the industry, and the books couldn't get distributed, and they started being censored. To try to save the industry, they started censoring the comics. So they could no longer publish the horror comics, and it was even difficult to publish science fiction and a lot of other subjects. Anything that wasn't really, clean-cut stuff was difficult. So EC shut down the regular comics, but Mad was starting to take off as a humor comic, so they turned it into a full-size magazine.
Yeah.
And before long, Mad became a very significant hit, and it was getting attention, it was getting press attention, it was getting publicity, and they were selling big numbers. Kirschman was very proud. Now, in the early days, they didn't know, the first few issues, it didn't look like it was going to be a hit.
Right. Yeah,
and the publisher,
money, yeah.
Bill Gaines,
yeah.
regularly would cite what made Mad a hit was the Wally Wood story, Super Duper Man, which appeared in Mad number 4.
Right.
And they said up until then, it was on the verge of cancellation. Mm-hmm. There was no reason to believe that Mad was ever going to be a hit. But when Super Duper Man came in, they knew they had something special there. And they ran it as the front issue, the front story that had, the Mad comic could have, 4 or 5 stories. They ran it as the lead story. Mm-hmm. And the reader response was fantastic. And they knew that this the things that Harvey had been trying before that, but they knew we could now lampoon anything. Right. They were doing kind of like humorous takeoffs on comic books and different genres or radio shows or whatever. But once they did it just kind of expanded their consciousness on where they could go. That the world was their oyster and that they could take on anything. Mm-hmm. And there was threat of suit from DC over that.
Yeah.
But that kind of goes off into another story. They worked it out, and when years later, when the copyright law was rewritten, they added a section of protection under parody, and that was largely because the people who wrote the copyright law were big Mad Magazine fans, and they wanted to make sure, you had, political cartooning was a rich tradition in America, and that's seen as part of freedom of the press. But somehow people didn't see that protection as flowing into comic books that were selling to kids.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really needed to be cited that lampooning or parodies needed to be protected in the copyright statute, and eventually it was written into the copyright law.
Yeah.
So it becomes a big hit, and as it is, it's bringing attention to Kurtzman. And any time somebody wanted to cover Mad in a newspaper article or a magazine article, the natural person for them to interview would be Harvey Kurtzman.
Mm-hmm.
And Kurtzman might mention, his key guys, Wood, Elder, Davis, Severin. But Severin left pretty quick. You could probably cite exactly what issue.
Yeah, it was issue 10. That was the last one.
Yeah. So how long after that was it that Craft launched?
Well, probably 2 or 3 years, because Mad was a comic book for another year and a half after that. And then I think Severin went over to Marvel for a while. It was Atlas at that time.
Doing westerns.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then Crack came along.
Westerns. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Crack gave him the platform where he could return to humor.
Right.
And so and he became the star. He was, without any question, he was the star. I mean, we would buy Crack. It was for the Severin. It's like, we get everyone else. So we in Mad, well, but Severin's in Crack now. We got to pick that up.
Right.
So then some of the limelight that was coming to Kurtzman included he met Hugh Hefner, who was becoming a big success with Playboy magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And so because they were getting all this attention at Mad and the sales were so good, Kurtzman was now seeing himself as more than a comic book editor. He's a magazine editor. He's not just the editor, he's the creator of it, and he's also the primary writer. He would also do some covers. He'd do a little bit of artwork, but usually the other artists do the artwork. He would do very loose little layouts that he would instruct them to follow. So he was getting a lot of the lion's share of the attention out of the success of Mad, and he met Hefner, and he was kind of commiserating how he wanted the magazine to go on slick paper instead of newsprint, and he wanted to have some color in there instead of all black and white. It's like, why, all the big successful magazines get slick paper and color. We're selling 1 million copies. Why can't I have slick paper and color? He saw it as something Harvey wanted.
Right.
And Bill's take on it, the publisher, Bill Gaines, his take was, even before the term existed, counterculture, there was a vibe. You had beatniks in the 50s, and there was a vibe of an alternative culture, even though people weren't using those terminologies yet. And Bill thought that there was something about that newsprint paper in black and white that tapped into that zeitgeist somehow. And that people that were reading Mad, they felt like, they felt like, oh, this is our special club, even though it happens to be a club that's selling 1 million copies of it.
Yeah.
And the fact that it cost a lot less money in production values and production expense made it easy for Bill to keep that point of view. Because you have to realize that he almost went out of business there with the Comics Code coming in. And all the money he had made on the horror comics was lost before Mad took off. But then Hefner tells Kurtzman, I will finance a big slick color magazine.
Mm-hmm.
You can leave Mad and I'll finance, and you'll have even more creative freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And so Kurtzman liked the sound of that. So he goes to Gaines, and he tells Gaines, give me 51% control, 51% ownership of this magazine, or I'm walking. Okay? and it's not. It's he's playing hardball.
Yeah.
You know, it's not blackmail, but it's definitely hardball because nobody thought that anybody. It never crossed anyone's mind that anyone could run that magazine but Harvey Kurtzman.
Right.
Okay. So, pardon my French, but Bill was rightfully about ready to shit a brick. And, I mean, it's time for a nervous breakdown. It's like, I can't give away 51, the difference between, Bill actually said, right at that time, his best friend was Joe Orlando.
Mm-hmm.
And Joe's wife worked as a secretary in Bill's office. And the two couples, Bill and his wife, Joe and his wife, they would go out to dinner like 3 times a week, every week. They would get together and play bridge. They would go on vacation together. That's how close they were. Mm-hmm. Okay, so at that juncture, at that time, his closest confidant was Joe Orlando. Well, Joe Orlando was one of Wood's closest confidants. They had been partners in the earlier Wood studio. But once they both got, the full, all the work they could handle out of EC, there was no reason for them to share studio anymore. So they both, went their separate ways, but they were still the best of friends. So Bill, it's natural that he's telling Orlando, and Orlando told this to me. The information you're getting me, I got straight from Joe Orlando, who was first person testimony of his interactions with his best friend Bill Gaines when Harvey was threatening to leave if he didn't get control of the magazine. And he told Joe, he says, if he had only asked for 49%, he said, I would have given him 49%, but he says, I'm the publisher. Yeah. I can't give him 51%.
Right.
It doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And it's almost as if Kurtzman knew there's no way Gaines was going to give him total control of the magazine. 51%, you've got total control.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, Kurtzman really wanted to go with Hefner. He saw that as the avenue to even a bigger time success than he already had with Mad.
Mm-hmm.
So he gave Gaines an ultimatum that he should have known Gaines could never fulfill or would never fulfill. All right? So, but Gaines told Orlando, he says, if you'd only asked for it, at 49% of Mad, millions of dollars.
Right.
Harvey would have been made for his life on Easy Street for life. 49% of Mad Magazine. Millions. Okay?
Yeah.
He would have been a millionaire very quickly. All right? And continued. So he partners up with Hefner, and they launch a title called Trump Magazine.
Right.
Now there is a title that is bound to fail. How many things have been named Trump that have failed? Trump Steak, Trump Airlines, Trump this, Trump that. They all hit bankruptcy very quickly. Right? So, anyway, they launched Trump. It's full color. But part of the game plan was not just to get the founder of Mad and to give him better money in a fancier, slicker magazine. But part of their success plan, their plan for success, was to take the talent with them.
Right.
Okay? We're not just going to create a better magazine than Mad. We're going to hit Mad with a torpedo and sink that ship. We don't have to compete with Mad if Mad goes under. We can take over as the top humor magazine.
Mm-hmm.
All right? So, at that point, it was still the lion's share of the work was done. Severn wasn't even there anymore. It's still Wood, Davis, and Elder.
Yeah.
And so And those were his right-hand men. Those were his closest associates.
Yeah.
Other than Severin. Did Severin do anything with Harvey after he left Mad?
As far as I know, no. That was it. I don't know how well Harvey and John got along,
Well,
I mean, I know he took over for Two-Fisted Tales kind of as editor, so, maybe that's kind of working together, Their
politics was different.
Yeah, definitely.
But Harvey and Will Elder and Wood were all liberals.
Yeah.
And Severin was very right wing.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you what's different between those days and these days is those guys had a great mutual respect for each other.
Yeah.
And they could have a heated discussion about politics, but they still listened to each other.
Right.
They listened to each other, and they all knew that the other guy's point of view, though they may differ with it, they all at the foundation of their point of view, they cared about the nation.
Right.
There was nothing more important than harmony of the citizens and the strength of the nation. Mm-hmm. They just had a different point of view of what's the best way to keep things flowing in a harmonious way. Right. And John was in the minority, being their resident right winger.
Right.
But it never stopped them. That never stopped them from being friends.
Right.
So that would be a good story for someone to cover.
Yeah.
I don't remember anyone really covering what happened. That had to be something else that broke up Kurtzman and Severin, because those guys have been tight for a long time.
Yeah. Well, didn't Severin take over for Two-Fisted Tales? I thought he kind of assumed the editorship of a sort, and that's what happened. Well,
it may have been that.
Because he still worked on that title. He didn't. Yeah. He just stopped working on Mad. Whereas Mad went monthly, and so Frontline Combat went away, and Kurtzman devoted his whole time to Mad. So I don't think he had time. Right. Now, after Cracked came along, all bets were off. Severin had a really sweet deal at Cracked, and so he was never going to do anything except he did like Incredible Hulk and a few things later. But in general, he was set after that point. But,
that was his bread and butter. That was his primary account.
Yeah. But,
do you remember what the last question was?
Well, the last.
Saving a Mad. We're still on Saving a Mad.
Yes,
okay, we're coming.
Yes.
Okay, here we go. Kurtzman threw down the gauntlet. He gives this ultimatum to Gaines. Gaines is on the verge of a nervous breakdown.
Right. He
is sweating bullets, and he's talking to Orlando, his best friend. Mm-hmm. And Gaines's kids called Joe Orlando Uncle Joe. They were raised with, that's Uncle Joe. Mm-hmm. That's how close they were. And so he's like, I don't know what I'm going to do. He says, if Harvey leaves, no, I don't think anyone can run that magazine. I'm going to have to shut the whole thing down. We were just getting back on our feet from all the losses they took because of the Keith Alver and censorship stuff that came, from in the 50s. They were just starting to get back on their feet thanks to the success of Mad, and now the way he's looking at it, Mad's walking out the door. Mad, he was looking at Kurtzman, that Kurtzman is the embodiment of Mad. And it's like, so he's sweating bullets, he's singing the blues to Orlando. Mm-hmm. And then he says, Orlando says, hire Feldstein back. Mm-hmm. Everyone else had been let go. There was no, Johnny Craig had been an editor. All those books were canceled. It was over. Yeah. There was nothing left but Mad, and Mad was a big success. And so Orlando had worked with Feldstein, and Feldstein, for a while, when Mad was a comic book, it was so successful they started a second humor one. But Kurtzman didn't have time to do it, so Feldstein did it, and that was Panic.
Right.
And Panic was really good.
Yeah.
And so on Panic, the artist did everything. For Mad, Harvey would do really rough for little thumbnail, little breakdown layouts and say, hey, follow my storytelling.
Right.
And he was a brilliant storytelling, so that was good.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the artists, including Wood, they didn't want to be obligated to follow that. If it was provided for them, they would probably follow it. But if they had what they thought was a better idea, they wanted the freedom to try what they felt was the better idea. But Harvey was a very tough guy to work for.
Yeah.
And Al Williamson and I were very close, and he says, I loved Harvey. I had all the respect for him. He was brilliant, but I would not want to work for Harvey.
Yeah.
He said he was a very tough man because you did it Harvey's way.
Mm-hmm.
He understood the artistic process. He understood that the artists had to have some room to enjoy their work, and to put some of their own creativity in it, and he wanted that. But if it was something Harvey wanted in it, he was going to demand, no, that's staying in. You do it my way.
Yeah.
So every now and then that would ruffle Wood's feathers or someone else's feathers a little bit. So Gaines says to Orlando, the readers don't even know who Harvey is. They care about, to them, the star of the show is Wally Wood.
Mm.
And he says, if we could keep Wood, and he knew, it seemed like Bill had at least a suspicion that Harvey was going to try to take the talent with him, which was Wood, Davis, and Elder.
Right.
Right? So Gaines said, if we could keep, if I took your suggestion, at first, to tell you the truth, he didn't want to hire Feldstein back. He told Orlando, I hate Feldstein.
No.
And Orlando's what's the hate? He's a good editor. He's a good writer. I worked with him. I didn't have a trouble with him.
Yeah.
He said, but see, Feldstein worked in the office with Bill.
Yeah.
All right? And he says, well, if I order a new typewriter, he'll pull it out of the box and use it before I get to. and Orlando said, that's a stupid reason not to hire a talented man.
Yeah. I've never heard that story. That's funny.
Yeah. I got that straight from Joe, and Joe got it straight from Bill. So, and then he talked, there was another advisor he had there, Lyle Stewart.
Yeah.
Was a close business advisor that Gaines had, and he talked to Lyle Stewart after he talked to Orlando, and Lyle said, yeah, I think that's your best bet, is hire Feldstein back. So Bill, he decides that's what he's going to do, and then he tells, but see, Panic was not a hit. Mad was a hit. Mad was run by Kurtzman. Panic was a quality humor comic, but it was never the hit that Mad was.
Right.
So Gaines had no, even though he had seen that Feldstein could write humor, that he could edit humor, and he knew Feldstein would make the deadlines, that didn't let him know that Mad would sell without Harvey.
Right.
So, and he was terrified that talent was going to follow Harvey to Harvey's new magazine. So he told Orlando, "You're close with Woody. If we can keep him, he's the star. He's our star. That he's the one that the people who buy the magazine, they're buying it for him. He's the number one name that they're looking for. If we can keep Wood, we might have a chance to make it without Harvey." And he didn't want to call Wood, but he wanted Orlando to work on him because he knew that Orlando was practically like Wood's brother. So as close as Joe was with Bill, Joe was that close with Wood. And if Wood was going to listen to someone, Orlando was going to listen to Orlando without thinking there was any ulterior motives or anything like that. And so Orlando told me he would call Wood and talk to him. He says, "You don't want to be chained to Harvey's layouts for the rest of your life." See, you can't get that elsewhere. That's got stuff, little tidbits like that.
Mm-hmm.
You gotta go straight to the horse and get it straight from the horse's mouth. And I got it straight from Orlando, and that's what he told Wood. It's like, you don't want to be chained to Harvey's layouts for the rest of your life,
Right.
you know. And Wood was like, he was loyal to Bill. He's like, because that's where he became a star. Now, he could go elsewhere based on his success at EC and Mad. He could go anywhere he wanted to. But he knew they had an interesting relationship, Gaines and Wood. Gaines knew that despite the fact that he had this who's list of talent, nobody was more important there talent-wise than Wood was, and that Wood had helped him build that company. And Wood knew that no matter how much talent he put on that page, nobody would ever know it if he didn't have Bill to publish it and to be behind him and to give him the artistic freedom to put all the stuff in there he wanted to put in there.
Right.
You know, and to provide good writers, you know, and they knew that they were breaking ground together. They were doing something between Harvey and Al's writing and Wood's art. And Wood wrote a little bit for EC too.
Yeah.
Not a lot,
Yeah.
but even when someone else wrote it, Wood would add ideas to it, and Wood would also give them ideas, which could bring us to another story on one of the most famous Wood stories. It was called My World.
Right.
We could talk about My World, and you know, there is some debate on who wrote the story.
Yeah.
Okay, was it written by Wood or was it written by Feldstein?
Thank you for listening, and thank you, J. David Spurlock, for being my special guest. Episode number 55 will be coming soon with part 2 of my interview with J. David Spurlock about Wally Wood. If you would like to comment and or be a guest on this podcast, please drop me a line at funideas.mark@gmail.com. Become a patron of Mark Arnold and Fun Ideas Productions. If everyone listening just contributed $1 a month, that would be a tremendous help in continuing the production of my books and this podcast. Also, subscribe to my YouTube channel. The opening and closing music for the Fun Ideas podcast is provided courtesy of Andrew the Slow Poisoner Goldfarb and is used with permission. This has been the Fun Ideas podcast. This is Mark Arnold speaking. This episode is copyright 2020, Fun Ideas Productions. Thank you, and good night.
Lace to rhinestone kisses on those blind eyelids and drive with your velour chauffeur across the river Styx. Popping creation pills in the pink electric church. The final flicker of your